right, well, good morning, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for coming and attending. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Melina Ambrosino, and I am the Vice President of Operations here at the Cherrytree Group. We are very proud to welcome everyone to our third annual conference, Developing a Brownfields Site by Building a Toolkit for Success. Before we begin, I just want to introduce our sponsors. Our first sponsor is our gold sponsor, Braden Ford from Aris.
Thank you, everyone. I'd just like to thank Cherrytree Group and everybody for attending this morning's event. My name is Braden Ford, again, account manager with Aris. For those of you who don't know our business, we supply database reports as well as historical products for environmental consultants and engineers working in the real estate due diligence market. We have a table out back here. If you have any questions for me or just want to have a quick chat about our products, please feel free to stop by the table. Thank you.
Our next sponsor is Vijay Tachi from Tachi Building Companies.
Good morning, all. I'm Vijay Tachi, as she said, Tachi Building Companies. My grandfather started the company in 1922. My brother's been running it since 1985. We're a full-service general contractor, single project body limit of $100 million, aggregate body limit $200 million, and we tend to do a lot of work that overlaps the Brownfields groups and historic preservation tax credits, because we enjoy doing a lot of historic preservation and adaptive use. And we're partnered with Warren and Melina, Cherrytree Group, on several pre-construction projects right now. I'm delighted with working with them, delighted to sponsor a great event like this. Enjoy.
And our next sponsor is Joe Foley from Alpha Analytical.
I too want to thank Cherrytree for the opportunity to come here and sponsor this event. Just expect we're doing this again from on an annual basis. Just want to remind everybody that we're Alpha Analytical, the only lab you really want to know. And just also want to remind you that in this day and age, with the news that's going around, you want to just make sure that you look at the financial stability of the labs you choose to do your work. I think when you do, you'll find that Alpha is a good choice.
All right, thank you. Before we begin the seminar, I just want to explain our firm for those of you who aren't aware of us. As most of you know, the Cherrytree Group is a group of entities. We specialize in tax credit consulting, brokerage, syndication, and specialty finance services. We primarily focus on the federal and state tax credits. And we also do development consulting, making us a one-stop firm for various commercial tax credit benefits. Over the years, we've been extremely successful in securing and monetizing millions of dollars in tax credits, which we are very proud of. In the past, our conferences have primarily focused on the Brownfields tax credits, as I'm sure some of you know, but this year we decided to do something a little bit different. Based on what we've been seeing in the industry lately, we've noticed that a lot of professionals are involved in all aspects of developing land, and they develop them from different perspectives. We wanted to bring those professionals together, which is our panel right here, to each demonstrate what they do in the process. The goal of this event is to demonstrate the various aspects of redeveloping contaminated land without breaking the bank and achieving financial success. Our speakers will be George Vallone, President of Hoboken and Brownstone Company. Our next speaker is William Alpine, Corporate Counsel and Director of Cost Recovery at Environmental Compliance Services. Paul Connors, Vice President of Business Development at Strategic Environmental Services. Joseph Quarantello, Senior Vice President at Risk Strategies. And of course, Warren Kirschenbaum, President of the Cherrytree Group. Our speakers will draw from their professional knowledge to explain how to work together to successfully develop a brownfield site from their industry perspectives. Our speakers will each take turn explaining how they would approach a brownfields redevelopment project using their professional experience based on a mock example we've created. This will be an interactive panel discussion, so we do welcome all questions. We just ask that you wait until the panelists have finished speaking. To begin, you have reference in front of you the mock example. I'm just going to read a little bit more about it so it paints the picture better for everyone. On our agenda, you'll see it is a made-up example at 123 Factory Drive in Somerville, Massachusetts. The property was historically used by tanning, chemical, and machining industries. The property in question is family-owned and started operations in 1950. Contamination started in the early 1960s from an oil spill originating from underground storage tanks that were used to heat the property. In addition, a substantial amount of contamination was found consistent with the historical use of the property. As the LSPs here can imagine, it was a contaminated mess. And it was shut down in 1995. Unfortunately, the site has remained unused for 20 years. Our Somerville is a lot like other towns you've seen in Massachusetts. It started as an industrial area, but has recently become a thriving community, attracting families and young professionals. 123 Factory Drive is zoned for mixed use. It is located within walking distance of public transportation and a good school system and near other shops and restaurants. This is an upcoming neighborhood with a strong economy and making it an ideal redevelopment. The property recently caught the eye of a savvy developer who has a vision to transform 123 Factory Drive into an upscale mixed-use residential commercial property. In order for this dream to become a reality, the developers with the entire property must be remediated to residential standards. He is sophisticated enough to recognize that in order to successfully develop the property in a manner that is both environmentally safe and financially sound, he must assemble a knowledgeable Brownfields team. The developer has teamed up with an environmental consultant to complete the Phase 1 and Phase 2 as part of the due diligence period of the purchase and sale agreement. Now the environmental consultant and the developer will formulate the best remediation plan for the property. The developer recruited an environmental lawyer to assess the legal risks in developing a contaminated site. He then added an environmental insurance broker to ensure that all risks are sufficiently covered. The developer knows he did not cause the contamination, and he is aware that Somerville, Massachusetts is in an economically distressed area, and he is confident that the remediation costs will exceed the 15% of the property's assessed value. Thus, the developer called a tax credit consultant to help him apply for the Brownfields tax credit, as well as seek any other tax credit opportunities the site has, both making this undertaking financially feasible. With that being said, let's begin our panel discussion. Our first speaker will be George, the developer. George, as a developer, what are some of your thoughts and concerns about the property, and how would you control the property and assess the risk?
Well, thanks, Melina. First of all, it's good to be here, and I think that all of us come to these kind of conferences for two reasons, basically. We hope we're going to learn some new things and be able to use that in our business, and we're looking to network. And so I, like you, come for the same reasons. I learn things when I sit on panels as much as I do when I sit in the audience. So I want to thank Melina and Warren for the opportunity. And just give you a little bit of background. I actually met Melina through a consultant, a partner of Dave Billow, who's sitting in the fourth row, and he works for an environmental company. I was speaking at a national Brownfields conference down in Atlanta many years ago, and I was giving a talk on financing brownfields and risk management, which is what I'm going to be speaking about in a minute. And one of the specialties that I have is working with landowners. So part of why I like to speak to folks that are in your business is because I happen to like brownfield sites the best. I'll be speaking about why that is in a minute. But you guys are sort of the vanguard of environmental opportunity as far as I'm concerned. You're typically the first people that get called, the environmental consultants, the environmental lawyers, the tax credit people, when somebody who owns a piece of property that's been contaminated either by him or by a previous owner is seeking to exit the property. And there are ways that property owners can work with a developer to create very, very high value exit strategies. There's probably 5 or 10 different structures that a developer like myself, working with a property owner of contamination, a property with contamination, can work to reduce risk and to maximize the value for the exit strategy. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my risk management process, and I'd like you to be thinking in terms of whether or not this type of approach might be a way you could recommend one of your clients to participate with a developer like me in one of these high-value exit strategies. So the first thing we need to do when we approach a contaminated property is to get some type of site control. And site control can be along a range of things, from very business and very informal to very legal and very formal. You could basically shake hands with somebody and say, well, I'm going to look into your property. Give me about 30 days. And if anybody comes along and is ready to write you a check on the spot to close on the property, just call me so I can stop doing what I'm doing. And oftentimes, a property owner will say, oh, that's cool. I'll give you 2 weeks, 30 days. And you know, just check in with me. I often say I'll check in with you once a week just to say what I learned and if I'm still interested in proceeding. And sometimes I can get site control as easily as that. Other times you need to send in a letter of intent. They sign it. It usually says that while you're in the process of drafting a purchase contract, you won't engage in negotiations with any other buyers. It's sort of a good faith type thing. I'm not even sure it's legally binding, but when somebody signs their name to it, if they're a halfway decent person, they usually live to the terms of it. And it'll say the seller's going to draft a contract, the buyer's going to draft a contract, whatever the case may be. And so you've essentially established site control just by doing that. Then once a contract is signed, there's usually always a due diligence period, and that can range depending upon the severity of the conditions and the severity of the risk and the unknowns. That can range from anywhere from 45 days to 120 days. And again, you've got a deposit down. It's typically very small. I don't see any reason to put more than a $5,000 or $10,000 deposit down on a piece of property while you're in due diligence, no matter how big the purchase price is, because you're essentially spending your time and money investigating the property owner's property and evaluating the risks and deciding whether or not you want to go forward. And then once due diligence is over, then a more customary 5 or 10% deposit goes down. And then if there are contingencies, whether the deposit's hard or soft, meaning refundable or not refundable, are things you negotiate. So the major risks in my world, and in order of importance, is entitlement risk, environmental risk, construction risk, market risk, and then financial risk. Because actually, I put financial risk last because until you know what the entitlement, environmental, construction, and market risks are, it's hard to assess what the financial risks are. So typically, I'll go through a risk management process where I'll evaluate identify the risk, which I just did, quantify it as best I can, and then assess how much I can reduce it or, all the better, eliminate it. So each of those risks require a certain process, and I'll take you through the process after everybody makes their, I'm considering this just sort of preliminary remarks, and then we'll all circle back again and dive a little bit deeper into different parts of the process. So essentially, establish site control, identify the risks, figure out how to manage those risks in such a way that you're going to either reduce or eliminate them, and then proceed to the next part of the transaction, which is to go hard on your deposit, unless you've got contingencies that need to be fulfilled, which is one way to manage risk, and start the assessment risk. So in terms of the environmental risk, which is the one we're most focused on today, although I will speak about all the other ones just briefly, the first thing we want to make sure is that we've got ourselves liability protections. It's been referred to typically as the innocent purchaser defense. And there's a protocol you need to go through. I think Paul, being an environmental lawyer, will be able to go into it much more specifically than me. But in general terms, I want to make sure that I follow the ASTM 1527 procedure or protocol so that downstream, if there's ever an environmental issue, and if there's ever a lawsuit or a liability claim of any sort, I've got some level of protection against that because I followed certain rules. As Melina said in our case study, I wasn't the person who contaminated the property. The last thing I want to do is get into the chain of responsibility if I'm not developing the site, or even if I start to develop the site and then decide to change course. So, so I think that's probably good for starters. Everybody's going to speak a little bit about, sort of set the table for the discussion, and then we'll drill a little deeper.
Yeah, thank you. So our next speaker is Bill, and he's the environmental attorney on this case. And some of the things I think Bill's going to talk about are the questions and concerns about the property, what he wants to know about the property, and just what he advised during the purchase and sale and due diligence period of the property.
Thanks, Melina. My name is Bill Alpine. I'm with Environmental Compliance Services. I'm in-house counsel. We do a lot of, obviously, the nuts and bolts of environmental consulting. I'm the corporate attorney. I get involved in a lot of the contract matters, a lot of the deals that our clients are getting involved with respect to acquisition. So that's where I'm coming from. I have a lot of experience with the ASTM that George mentioned. The first thing that, if I'm brought into this, and hopefully it's sooner than later, is from the preliminary stage when George is having this discussion, I'm going to have some questions with George about background of the site. Is it a purchase deal? Is it a foreclosure? All of those do matter, especially if there is a property that's been sitting there for years. There could be encumbrances on it. There could be liens. So you want to make sure that getting that out of the way is of utmost importance, and that's probably consistent with the total risk in identifying what's out on the property. The next phase, obviously, is the due diligence, and from that perspective, as George said, ASTM 1527 is the protocol that everybody uses, which identifies the recognized environmental conditions and concerns at the site. And that is where you get your innocent landowner defense. There's a lot of other things that I would be Q&Aing George on, from the perspective of what's this purchase and sale going to look like? Is there going to be any seller representations? Is the seller just going to walk? Is there any contingencies for things like the unknown contamination that usually results and can result after the site is acquired and after you start putting your drill rigs in the ground? And again, the ASTM, are you looking at just the concerns that have been identified, especially when you're going into the phase 2, or is it going to encompass the, in this case, Massachusetts contingency plan? Is it going to be a full array of identifying all the issues? Has the site been in the system with the MCP? Is it in default? Is there any deadlines that we need to reestablish as a buyer coming into this property? So without getting too much into the detail, that's where I'm more or less coming into.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Paul, and Paul is the trusted environmental consultant. And Paul, we've talked a lot about this, and part of the things that we've talked about is what your role is as the environmental consultant to get the best end result in working towards the end. So can we touch upon that a little bit?
Absolutely. First of all, I want to thank you, Melina and Warren, for having me join this panel. The trusted advisor consultant. I can see most of you out there are trusted advisor consultants to your clients, so I won't bore you all. But in my experience, in a scenario like this, it's equally important for the consultant, the environmental consultant, to not only do his or her work assessing the property, but probably equally importantly, if not more importantly, to absolutely understand the end goal of the developer in as much as how the development plan is going to be affected by the discovery of any and all environmental challenges during the assessment. I cannot tell you all how many times in my experience having that clear understanding of the end goal, how important that was in the consultant's work. I also have experienced, when working with a team in a scenario like the one we have, how important it is for the team to collaborate and work together. These aren't independent efforts that we're making. What I do is driven, a lot by crafting a plan, working with Warren and his team, for instance, making sure that we understand how tax credits would become available depending on how we deal with issues that we discover. We also want to keep in mind that, in my experience, and probably in a scenario like this, regardless of how the developer acquired the property to develop, it's likely that a lender is going to be brought into this process at some point, and the lender's liability concerns germane to environmental issues are paramountly important to be considering. In most cases, it's my experience that the property itself ends up being part of the collateral pool for construction and development loans. And helping lenders mitigate their liability concerns through well-planned approaches to dealing with issues and working with environmental insurance brokers to mitigate their concerns is hugely important. So, we understand the end goal. We know who the team players are. We go at our work. The ASTM protocols are paramountly important. But in my experience on brownfield developments, in my company, we kind of call the protocol ASTM Plus, or ASTM on steroids. We want to have a thorough understanding of the environmental issues, because mitigating those issues or dealing with those issues becomes paramountly important in the fiscal plausibility of the development itself. So we will include in our assessment pretty customarily doing building hazard surveys, and a lot of things that kind of transcend the baseline ASTM standards. We get all of that information. Our thinking during this process is we're going to need to quantify the likely costs to remedy issues, not just do an assessment and point them out. And in order to develop the cost to cure remedies, we're going to have a really, really thorough understanding of what we're dealing with here. It's very important because of all this that the consultant is brought into this process very early in the process. And I think you're going to hear the same thing by each of the speakers today. Things go relatively smoothly in these brownfield developments when we're brought in early in the process. I'm sure that a lot of you have experience being brought in anything but early in the process. I mean, how many of us have been asked to do a phase one assessment, and you got 3 weeks to do it because there's a closing, and that's how little. It's very important, if you can, to convince your clients that you being brought into this process very early in the process is hugely important, and it also allows you the time to do the collaboration with the developer, the attorney, the insurance broker, and the tax specialists, so that we're all going at this with one common goal in mind: to compliantly navigate through identifying and ultimately dealing with environmental issues, so that the development can be brought to successful fruition. I'm sure we'll talk more about the nitty-gritty as this goes on. Thank you all.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Joe, and Joe's an expert in all things related to an environmentally contaminated property and how to insure it. So Joe, let's open this up. This, obviously, the historical use of this is heavily contaminated. What would you advise the client?
Thanks, Melina. So one of the things, and you'll hear the common theme right through, is really working from the end goal backwards. Oftentimes what happens is projects start and they don't really look at the end game and what the ultimate solutions can be. And I've seen projects where they've gone out there and they come in with a grand plan, they start excavation, they're digging, and before they know it, they're off the project and bankrupt. And I've seen that happen quite a few times over the course of 15 years or so. So one of the things that we try to do is we try to put fences around liabilities, but there are a number of insurance products out there that will protect any party in the transaction from the cradle to grave liability. So as you guys know, you're never out. They can always claw back in, especially if there was a regulatory reopener. In Connecticut, I don't know if any of you guys work in Connecticut, but I think in the last 7 years, I think they've had at least 5 regulation changes down there. And so what we try to do is we try to put these programs in place that will protect either a lender, a buyer, a seller, from liabilities that come in the event that they pass any type of corporate veils or any type of legal agreements. The other thing that these programs can be used as is selling tools. If you've got, developers generally will go into a project, they're buying the property, they're figuring out what their project's going to look like, and then maybe at the very end they sell. But oftentimes what happens is the developer buys the property and then flips it. So he never even gets to the development piece of it because the opportunity is there for them to make some money. So these programs can actually be used as a tool in lieu of providing an escrow or an indemnity. You can actually have these policies assigned to the buyer. It could protect all parties in it. Lenders today are a lot smarter than they were a few years ago. Even lenders today that are very savvy when it comes to environmental. If you have a site that's tough enough for them, even they would shy away from those things. And we can show them ways that there are programs out there that can protect them, cap the overruns on a remediation project, pick up the unknown liabilities, pick up the toxic tort liability. Everybody puts numbers around remediation projects, but the unknown, the big unknown is the BI, the bodily injury, the property damage type claims. So there's protections out there for that, and we work we work very closely with attorneys and consultants. From an attorney standpoint, we're crafting language that meets the obligations of the transaction. So it's very important that, and you probably see it, and I see it a lot, is that they go into these transactions and there's no environmental counsel at the table. And that totally blows me away because, you might have corporate attorneys at the table, real estate attorneys. They don't know environmental. And so, and Paul and I have worked together quite a bit, and we always talk about going in with a team that would be turnkey. And that's really why I think we're sitting here today is that I think if you're going in with a full approach, with a full team that is addressing each aspect of the project, you want to be in a place where you're nimble enough to move with the project. I'll get into some of the products a little bit later, but the one project that sticks out in my mind was a project almost similar to this. The site sat dormant for 20 years, and nobody could figure out how to get this site developed. And a couple of contractors went out there and tried. One ended up in bankruptcy and the other walked away. And then it sat there for another 10 years. And the motivation was there from regulators and from the town, so they had everybody's buy-in, but nobody could really figure out what the issues are. And so we worked with the developer, we worked with the regulators, we worked with the consultant, and all of those people are at the table when it comes time to negotiate these types of programs. And then we worked especially with the attorney. And we met with the regulators, and we knew that this site had two issues. It had groundwater issues, and it had soil issues. And the groundwater issues, they were under pump and treat. It was working well. Even the lender wasn't, I mean, pretty savvy lender, not concerned about the groundwater issues at all, but was concerned about the soil issues. And so, and they saw what happened to one of the contractors where they went bankrupt, just trying to dig out all this material. And so what we did is we talked with the developer about modifying their development plan, going back to regulators and saying, you know, we know we're not going to get regulatory closure. Would you give us substantial completion? And they looked at us like we were kind of crazy. Well, what good is that going to do you? Well, it made a big difference, because when we went to the carrier, we said to the carrier, would you agree that substantial completion meets regulatory closure on the issue on the soils? And they did. And so what we did is we got regulatory closure for the soils, and that was the concern of the lender, which enabled them to get the funding to get the project off the ground. So it's very important that you have all the key individuals at the table. If you don't have the attorney at the table, the deal never gets off the ground. If you don't have a consultant that is looking at it with a clear exit strategy and end goal in the end, that project doesn't happen. And I think that's the difference. And then I'll talk later on about some of the things like guaranteed fixed price, where you can buy insurance to protect yourself from that. Gives you an advantage over other competitors that are on time and material. And I know you guys love time and material, so don't misunderstand me there. But you know, there are times when you're in a dogfight and you need whatever means to be competitive. And so there are products out there that can provide that. There are companies that will partner with you that are liability transfer companies. They'll actually step in the shoes of the responsible party, become signatory under the consent order. And it enables your client to walk away from those issues. And it gives them immediate balance sheet relief and potential tax credits as well. So there's a lot of things out there surrounded by insurance that, and Paul says it all the time, and I kind of take it, I just assume that everybody knows that there's insurance products out there that can provide these protections. But what I find out is that they don't. I mean, there's a lot of environmental attorneys that don't even realize that there's insurance products out there. And I'm not talking about, you know, I think everybody's conception about insurance is that there's, I think the two biggest misconceptions are, one is insurance costs a lot of money, environmental insurance costs a lot of money, and it doesn't provide a lot of coverage. And both of those things couldn't be further from the truth. So as we get into the project, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the products that would be applicable here.
Thank you, Joe. So, Warren, based on this conversation, we see this a lot, that this starts to get expensive. The LSP, the remediation, the legal fees, insurance, and there are programs out there, which is what we do, to help recoup some of those costs. So what would you advise a developer with the various tax credits that we could get to help them?
Thank you, Melina. What a great question. I first wanted to step back and just thank you and Lily for the work you've done putting this thing together year after year, and we really appreciate it. It's a wonderful event. Welcome, everybody. And always on a Friday morning getting into Boston, fighting the traffic, we're happy that you're here and with us, and thank you to the panel and the sponsors. What I would say, Melina, is, as you know, in our company, our hallmark is teamwork, and we try and work together on all the projects that we have and put as many bodies as we can that are capable in the particular areas. So I stress teamwork very much, and that is the theme of this panel and what we're doing today. So we are tax credit people. That's what we do. And one of the tax credits is the Brownfields tax credit. But in this example that you set up, there are other credits as well. But the tax credit is it's a patchwork of financing, if you will. And so in advising George, there are grants, there are incentives, there are low-interest loans, there are insurance products, and the Commonwealth of Mass also gives an allocation to help you get that insurance in place. So these are all good aspects and part of the financing. We come into it with that tax credit portion, not the, we don't focus on the grants or the incentives, but from a tax credit perspective, there are tax credits that you can get prior to moving forward with the development, and those are pre-funded, and there's those that you can get once you've incurred the expenses. In this particular situation, the Brownfields credit is something that you would be entitled to once you have already made the expenditures. So that certainly doesn't alleviate the challenge from the developer's standpoint of coming up with the cash, but at least there's the possibility that after they've incurred these expenses, there can be a reimbursement, and in the case of the Massachusetts Brownfields credit, it could be up to 50% of what those eligible costs are. And we would be advising George and helping him in developing that pro forma budget to show him that that part of these expenses may be covered and reimbursable, and that may tilt the balance in favor of actually moving forward with the development, particularly where you've got a thin pro forma, and this can make or break the transaction. When you mentioned that we have a group of entities, what we've been trying to do is see if we can bridge fund those tax credits, because the state tax credit, the way that it traditionally works is that it's transferable only once the tax credit is issued, and therefore there's a possibility, if we're confident in the actual tax credit, that we would bridge it going forward and be able to provide some of that cash to George in the beginning. In this wonderful example that you created, and our attorney's going to take a different approach maybe, but assuming that this building does not come down, that's on the property, and George is thinking of doing a residential development and perhaps rental apartments, he could be restricting those apartments to those people that fit within a certain income level, and would be able to possibly look at low-income housing credits. Were it a gateway city, as in Massachusetts, there's a second tax credit limited to $2 million per project. That's also transferable, and then if this wonderful site was on the historic register, or it was in a historic district or eligible for being listed, then this redevelopment could possibly generate historic tax credits. So what we do is we help advise on on these tax credits. We help develop that pro forma and make these business decisions. It's very good to have us on board as part of the team early on, because we can also help with the way George would structure his entities and how the payments would flow, so that we can maximize the amount of credits that they're getting, and we don't suffer line item denials from the state. We can work with the trusted environmental professionals here to talk about how they are wording the remediation plan and their filings with the DEP, so that when these tax credits are reviewed by the Department of Revenue, we're protecting and maximizing the ability to get these approved. So I can go on forever, but
We only have till 11.
okay.
So I guess we can open this up, and if you guys want to talk, and you guys are feel free to ask questions and more you want to hear about it.
So, I think I saw a question back, brother? No, yawning. Okay, stretch, we allow stretching.
Could you talk about what eligible costs represent, and then the other issue is the transferability of the tax credits per se?
Okay. So eligible costs are costs that are directly related to the remediation, and they tie them to 21E, and they do specifically mention a bunch of costs, like they'll say testing, LSP, expenses, legal expenses, to the extent that those are only environmental. So setting up an entity, closing on the property, those kind of legal expenses would not be applicable. A demolition would be a direct cost if we could show that the contamination was in a place that we couldn't get to without bringing down the building or doing something like that. Excavation, the fees that to move the soil that you have to pay to dispose of it, the clean fill. Other things can be eligible expenses, and that is fact-specific, and that's where we get into kind of a debate with the state. So an example would be that if in a construction you had to build a road or tear out trees and things like that specifically to get to remediation, then that would be a direct cost. But it's not, in a general construction budget, building a road or doing things that are not environmentally directly related would not be an eligible cost. There have been times where a fence to contain the site, the cost of that would be eligible. Security, those have been determined to be eligible, but not in every case.
How about things that are related to a deed restriction, like paving, that's part of the AUL?
So that would be that so you've paved. In that particular situation, you've remediated to an industrial standard, you've put an AUL, and you have paved over the contamination.
And it's required within the AUL. The paving is required within the AUL.
I would, my argument is that that is a directly related cost.
And you said remediation, you don't really mean the construction side of it, you mean the assessment and drilling and testing and all that stuff would be considered a part of the remedial cost, not just the construction side.
Well, if I'm understanding, so if we've worked on a project like in Fort Point Channel where we have a big construction project and there's a multi-million-dollar construction budget. There are items that are not directly related to the remediation. The landscape architecture, the construction of an underground parking garage, if we weren't removing contamination, things like that are not going to be included. So it's very fact specific.
I think, interrupt you for a second, Bob. I think what you're talking about is remedial construction, and the difference between what we all call technical services and remedial construction. They're all part of eligible. General construction isn't. Remedial construction is.
And the assessment to get to the remedial.
Yes, if it's done properly and everything's worded properly, and Warren has made a great point, several great points, but one in particular is working closely with Warren and his team is important, because how the consultant words things, for instance, will have a profound effect on whether or not it ends up being eligible for reimbursement or for tax credits.
But
Yes.
that assessment, when you mention assessment, the point there is that it is that those kind of assessment expenses, testing expenses, they're going to just draw a line, and it's going to be very black and white as to when those were conducted. So if those are being conducted pre the taxpayer claiming the tax credit, pre-ownership for them, then those are going to be excluded. So this is an example about where we could come in and help to maximize, because the statute says that you are you're eligible for the credit if you are an owner or a lessee. So at the point that you may be working for a client that has signed a purchase and sale agreement, they're not the record owner at that point. They're incurring assessment and testing costs. Those are going to be ineligible, even though they're eligible costs, because it falls outside that ownership period. So we might be able to cover those in a lease agreement and build in some lease language or a separate document that gives us the right to enter onto the property, incur those expenses, and pay for them, and as part of a lease agreement, we can claim those.
I think so. Warren, could I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
So if I have a property under contract, long-term site control, talking more like 2 years, maybe longer, before I'm going to close. If I have the owner of the property, the seller, contract with the LSP company to do the investigation work, and then I agree in my contract that I'm going to reimburse the seller at the closing for those costs, would they then be eligible? Because I wouldn't be paying for them till the day I close when I own the property.
We'd need those two elements. So one is that the tax credit goes to the taxpayer that paid the expenses.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't run with the land. And so that element you would have in that you've paid.
So then I could include them once I pay for them at the closing.
But we need to have
That
we need to have that leasing. We
In the
need to have
contract,
lease-
the
we need
language has
both
to
of
be in the
those.
contract.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, what we've seen with the state is that if we come in with you and you've paid for you've reimbursed at the closing, so effectively you've paid for those,
Right.
but you were not either the owner or lessee at the time of the testing and the assessment, then they're going to kick those out.
Oh, so it can't be done that way? You're
We
saying
have-
I can't structure the deal that way?
We can what we would do is we would put language into that long-term P&S, or we would have a separate agreement that says that in addition to you purchasing the agreement on a specific day, purchasing the property on a date certain, we've got a lease to the property, whereby we have the right as a lessee to enter onto that property, and we will incur those expenses. And our consideration for getting that lease is the fact that we will incur those expenses. So that would be a lease agreement.
Okay.
That's why when I talk, Milo talk about getting together with the team before you begin your assessment is so important. All of these kind of strategies get discussed and formed before you begin your work, and it may be pivotally important to whether or not you're eligible for tax credits, for instance.
I think we had a question.
think we had-
there, yeah.
Yeah.
Just clarification on an eligible expense. At many brownfield sites, there's a premium cost of doing business on that site, even though the specific activity is not a remediation, revolving around, the work needs to be done under a RAM plan. There are health and safety and maybe personnel monitoring costs because the material is contaminated. Are those costs also eligible?
Generally, the state has not looked at and questioned LSP costs.
Well, what about the contractors need to have OSHA certified workers, for example? Or the need to have the work performed under a RAM plan, the costs incurred by the contractor, not the LSP. In other words, if you were to go to bid on a brownfield site and tell the contractor it's an MCP site and they need to meet these certain OSHA requirements and they need to conduct their business in a certain way, it results in a premium cost that is quantifiable. And is that something in your experience that would be recognized as an eligible cost?
So that's a third-party cost, and is that coming under your bill? And when you say premium, you're not marking it up with a premium.
No, the contractor could line item their additional costs incurred because of the MCP work, because of the nature of the work on an MCP site.
I think it's eligible.
Construction costs, and it's, because it's an MCP site, it's a remediation, environmental cost. I mean, it's not a cost that they would incur on a non-MCP site. So my question is, can that be itemized as an environmental cost that is eligible?
I think so.
But is it your experience that the state has accepted that?
The state has accepted that. The only hesitation I have is that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, having accepted it to date, doesn't mean that if we file your application next week, they're going to still do that. They're very uneven in their approach. And so up to this point, they haven't questioned anything to do with LSP testing or any of the subcontractors or any of these costs that you mentioned. And I don't think they will, but, and I think they are eligible, but.
So in terms of structuring a construction project, would it make more sense to have certain costs managed by the environmental professional as opposed to the contractor? Because I think conventionally it's put under the contractor cost, but I mean, if it's the fact, because it's a contractor's cost, if that puts that at risk, would it help?
It would help. It would help. And we have a specific example of this because we have there's a procedure in the state where if they question, let's say, those particular costs, they would approve the tax credit and propose to deny those particular costs. We could then take the tax credit that's been approved and appeal those costs that they propose to deny. And we did exactly that. And we had a soil removal and remediation, excavation and disposal, which the state was saying was not remediation related. And we did show that that it was, and it was that we had to hire that contractor, and it was specifically MCP required, and these costs were legitimate, and we did prevail. But they did ask those questions because it just came in as a contractor cost. So I think it would help.
I think there's a question.
We do millions of dollars in brownfields projects, and we don't use any consultants or attorneys. I'm just kidding. That's to see if everyone was awake.
Everyone stays.
We use a lot of consultants and a lot of, but I don't have any business guys. My question, this is an interesting area. You're hearing it. We bridge the credits, the brownfields credits, and a lot of times that's the difference in the pro forma to fill the gap. We've been burnt on this, the inconsistency of the Department of Revenue in the regulations and interpretations of the credits. We got to fix this. I've been doing historic tax credit deals for years, and it's very clear, and you sell the credits, and you know going in, there's now all kinds of programs that now bridge the historic credits, and they do their due diligence and they get comfortable with it. The funds have to be up front. We need the money up front in order to get the project going. So what can we do? We really need to start a conversation, I think, on the environmental side, starting with the new secretary and the administration and the commissioner, talking with the Department of Revenue, with Secretary Lepore and the new commissioner. We've got to get some clarity on the regulations in terms of where DOR is going with this, because it's an environmental issue, but it's an economic development issue, and we need the money up front in order to make decisions are made with how you proceed with the project, and we got to figure out a way to eliminate the risk. So I'd be interested in hearing if there's any thoughts of, are there blatant inconsistencies? What are some of the examples? How can we get this clarified? Can it possibly be put in a regulation that makes it a little more clear, so that you can get the assurance that you're going to get there, at the end of the project?
I can tell you in New Jersey, where I do most of my work, I agree with your point. It would be great to get the money up front. I don't think that's ever going to happen, because they're going to make sure that you did the work, you spent the money. You're talking about predictability and certainty. So in New Jersey, you submit a list of your eligible costs. You do your site investigation, you get your remedial action work plan, you bid the work, you know what your costs are going to be. You submit that with your brownfield reimbursement application. They do it as a reimbursement in New Jersey as opposed to a tax credit. It eliminates that step of selling the tax credits. So, but on the other hand, the reimbursement only comes as taxes go to the state. So it could take longer than just selling the tax credits at a discount right up front. Some pluses, some minuses there. But once you have the brownfield reimbursement agreement signed by the state, you have certainty now. You have predictability. They've agreed on the eligible costs. You still have to produce all the receipts, verification of payment, to substantiate you spent the money you said you're going to spend. But if you do, and it's on that list that you submitted and they approved, you're going to get your reimbursement ultimately. So I think certainty and predictability is the best you're going to hope for. And I think that, having a team like this, and now in Massachusetts, where there's this little bit, it sounds like there's this little bit of uncertainty and lack of predictability, I think it's even more important that you have a team that's done this before, that understands the law, that can look at the certified costs and ways to make sure additional costs are certified. I mean, I just learned something 5 minutes ago. I've got to go talk to the seller of the piece of property I'm working on here in Massachusetts, and I've got to come up with some kind of an agreement. It's either going to be a lease while I'm in contract, or it's going to be some other mechanism, some contract, additional contract language, because I am doing an environmental liability transfer. This is the one I'm involved in, not our Somewhereville deal. This is in a realwhereville. We're going to take the liability on. We're going to execute the investigation, the remediation work, and we're going to take the environmental liability on in the future, because that's one of the things was the hot button for the seller. So so I think that the more I can get in eligible costs, the better. But I have to step back a second, because 3 of the panelists said the same thing I said to begin with. You have to know what your exit strategy is. You have to know what's the plan for the property, which is why in my world, entitlement risk comes first. You have to know, A, what do you think you want to do with the property, and then B, are they going to let you do that? If you're buying industrial property and it's still zoned industrial, and I want to do like our example here, I want to do a mixed-use residential over retail, I need a use change. Am I going to get that? I'm going to talk to the town, I'm going to talk to the citizens, I'm going to talk to whoever I got to talk to and see whether or not there's a, what's the risk that I'm going to get that use change and I'm going to get the zoning I want. The property I'm working on right now with Dave, I have to get a town vote. We don't do things like that in New Jersey. In New Jersey, you go to the planning board if it's an as-of-right approval, you go to the zoning board if you need a use change, and if you want to make things a little bit easier and the politics is in your favor, you go to the city council and they actually adopt the zoning you need, in which case you go back to the planning board for an as-of-right approval. So here I'm in a situation where I've been working for a year now with a community advisory group we put together. It's a large site, a lot of potential asset impacts to the city, to the town. So we put together a citizens advisory committee. We've been meeting now monthly for a year. The advisory committee just voted to approve the plan to go to the town. I'm now starting a community outreach process where I met with the town selectmen, public hearing. We filmed a cable TV show to show the presentation on local cable TV through the summer. The next night I did a meeting in front of 150 people at the middle school. I would say 95% of the people liked the project. We're going to have additional meetings throughout the rest of the summer, and then in November there's a town meeting, and they actually vote. I think it's 60% of the people have to vote because there's going to be a... This is a, no, privately owned property. It's actually owned by the Archdiocese of Boston. But it's not zoned for what I need to do there. We're going to do age-restricted housing, townhouses, market rate rentals, assisted living, retail, office. So, so you need to know, what's that?
Good luck.
Good luck.
I'm also a PE.
I appreciate it.
Planning boards and ZBAs and the others ad nauseum. And
Yeah.
let me tell you,
Yeah.
I was in one city and it took a guy a year to get through the ZBA to get a sign up, let alone changing the use of the property.
Yeah, well, one of the things I checked out when I was doing my early stage risk management, which is where I go basically talk to a lot of people, this was a very high profile site and it had been laying fallow for 20 years. And since it's owned by the Archdiocese, guess how much property taxes they pay? Zero. So there's a lot of interest in getting the property developed, but in a certain way. They've got issues, they've got 40B concerns. They've, that affordable housing law you guys have here where you can jam that down a community's throat under certain conditions. They don't want that. And once I learned about that, I said, well, I'm not going to do that because it's not the way I operate. I'm either going to go into the town and do a great project that's a win for the town, that's a win for me, a win for my investors, or I'm not going to do it. I have plenty of other places that like what I do. And so the first thing I said was, I want a community advisory committee. I want your most active citizens. I want people from the community, from the town leaders. I want a selectman. I want somebody from your planning board, somebody from your environmental commission. I want your business administrator, your town planner, and a half a dozen citizens that you think care. And we're going to meet and we're going to work out a plan. So that's how I manage entitlement risk. And if the vote doesn't come through in November, I don't know if I'm going to stick around anymore. I'm going to basically say, okay, see ya, I tried. I thought you liked what I was doing, but maybe more, not 60% of you agreed with me. I really do think we're going to get the vote. So once I know what I'm allowed to do in terms of the entitlements, which establishes the plan, or the redevelopment plan, I then move into the environmental track. Because there's no reason to spend a couple $100,000 investigating a piece of property that I'm not going to be able to develop. So entitlement risk comes first, then environmental risk. The first thing I talk about, I think about is this liability, innocent purchaser defense, or innocent landowner defense, as Paul referred to it as. I think it's the same thing. So that's my second track. And one of you guys mentioned, testing and the reliability of the lab. I happen to believe you over-test the site. A lot of developers say, what's the minimum amount I can do of environmental investigation? And the problem with that is, maybe you'll get it right and maybe you won't. You won't discover you didn't get it right until much later in the process when you've got much more capital committed. And the number one cost of a redevelopment project is the cost of capital. It's not concrete, it's not labor, it's the cost of capital. For me as a developer, it is the #1 most expensive line item. So I will over-investigate early in the process. As soon as I've got entitlement risk done, I'm going to start a major site investigation. I want to know more about that property than God knows about that property. Because if I've, while I've got the least amount of capital committed to the property, I want to know that. Because if I've closed, I'm in construction, somebody discovers something and oops, yeah, maybe I went to Joe and I've got a PLL liability policy that'll cover me for unknown stuff that pops up. But guess what? I got a ton of capital committed and the meter is running. And if I got to go back and reinvestigate and re-remediate something we missed, it's going to cost me so much more than what a thorough site investigation would have cost me up front. It's not even like order of magnitude more it's going to cost me. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Melina has to pick the people for questions.
I'll say.
It's interesting to see this panel here because I've been doing this in Massachusetts, as many of us here, for 30 years. And I don't think on a project I've ever sat down with a full lineup like you, of your group, to go over what people want to do. At the most, it's with either the purchasers or the owner's attorney. And this leads back to what this other gentleman said, is everybody wants the clean ASTM phase 1 to start, because then they can go to get the bank and get some money, and they don't really, many times a purchaser or if a person owns a property, doesn't really want to know what's there, because he's already drooling for that piece of property. He's got the $5 million residential complex up, and he just wants an ASTM so he can go and get his money from the bank and get his project started.
You know, the banks are getting smarter. The banks are doing things like forbidding commercial loan officers for as to deciding what level of assessment is done on things. The banks are keenly aware of liability in a big way, and they want it mitigated. You know, sounds like you need better clients. You know, yeah, some are. The future. I got to tell you, in my work, I do a lot of work outside of Massachusetts, and I got to tell you that as crazy as a lot of this sounds to people that aren't familiar with doing this kind of stuff in Massachusetts, there's a lot worse places that don't have anything. They don't have any foresight. They don't have any brownfield initiatives. They don't have anything, and they're looking at why, for instance, is the city of Boston probably, arguably, one of the most contaminated pieces of real estate in the universe. Why is there so much robust development going on in and around the city of Boston, Massachusetts? And I like to think it's because, I live in Rhode Island, by the way. You talk about a crazy place. By the way, if you were trying to do what you're talking about doing in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, good luck. Because whether or not it's logical doesn't always even seem to matter to folks. But you know what? Boston is one of the most robust development areas in the country, and a lot of places that are struggling close by. Connecticut, for instance, was looking at why all this lucrative development in and around the city of Boston, and they're coming to realize that the Transfer Act, for instance, is kind of stifling the lack of brownfield tax credits and other brownfield initiatives, and they're looking at Massachusetts, right, Warren? And as crazy as some of the stuff is, and even with the uncertainties around tax credits in Massachusetts, Connecticut's looking at it like, hey, that's driven a lot of successful development up in Massachusetts.
Connecticut asked us to come and consult with them. And they said that they want to try and adopt a Brownfields tax credit statute that doesn't have some of these issues that we have in Massachusetts. So cut out some of the problems that we've created. And I want to just get to Craig's point, because this statute, this Brownfields tax credit statute in Massachusetts is, in my opinion, one of the best in the nation. And what we have now, with the way that the statute is being implemented by the regulators, is creating a chill in the marketplace. And I think that's what Craig's point, I think, is excellent, because what you're saying is that we're trying to create an efficient marketplace in the financial sector. And a good example is we do work on the historic credits, and with Tochi Building Company, that's correct. We're working on these historic tax credit projects, and we can give certainty as to when we can give the funding, when we can, what we can bridge at, how, and what you're trying to do is create that same process in brownfields, which we support and we want to do, but not knowing when those credits are going to come out, how they're going to be evaluated by the state, and what line items they're going to throw out this week gives you indigestion, right? And I'll give you a good example. This, we worked on an urban site, a Boston site, and so the contamination was underground. They had to dig 8 feet to get rid of the soil, and they built an underground parking garage. When our tax credit was approved, which was it was $1 million tax credit, so $2 million in spending, they gave us $200,000, and they denied $800,000, and they did it on a formula that they said they're only approving 3/8 of the cost, because they felt that only 3 of the 8 feet that we dug was necessary. Now, not only is that just ridiculous, but we have gone into the Department of Revenue on other cases where we knew we were going to get denied and said, give us 2/3, give us 3/4, give us some kind of a fraction, and they've said, you're insane, we don't deal in fractions. And 6 months later, they're doing the same thing on one of our tax credits. So that's a pure example of inconsistency.
I think too, just to touch, I just wanted to add a comment that when you say the uncertainties, that we know that, and what we're doing is trying to work around that, which is why we say you need to assemble a team, because you do need the council on it to look at that and pick apart what they're saying, and that's why you hire a consultant like us and you put a team together like this so that we can work on that for you. It's more art than science, I think, is what you normally say, that we need to come up with a package and we need to submit it, so that's why.
But that point you made goes right to the heart of that as well, because if that expense from the third-party contractor, we have to pay attention now as to how they're going to invoice that and what they're going to describe as the work that they're doing, knowing the pushback that we're going to get from the state.
Yeah, just to comment on what he was saying, now is the time to get to Secretary Jay Ash and to the governor. They're absolutely looking for input on how to improve the opportunity for economic development in the state. You know, whether this is going on for another 90, 120 days, you got to get the input into these guys so they can deal with the state agencies that are.
We agree, and I think that Craig's point is well taken, because that meeting that you were at 2 days ago, right, where Secretary Ash was there, and he indicated that he'd be willing to listen to what we said, and then he asked us to write a letter, which I don't know that we want to write some kind of hate mail that they distribute around the state with our name on it. So if a couple of us can get together, then.
Yes.
I think following up on these discussions we're talking about with the Department of Revenue, we've had over 20 years now with the program with the MCP, and originally this reduction in the tax credit, if you have a site with an activity and use limitation, really doesn't make any sense. My understanding is the original premise was, and I've heard this from DEP officials, that if you had an AUL, you didn't spend as much money on a site. And I think if you really look at what's going on, that isn't really the case. It's a tool that's available to us. It's something that is allowed properties to develop. It's just part of our toolbox now. And the original premise that had that reduction in the tax credit really doesn't apply, and I think this is something that DOR needs to really be aware of based upon the last 2 decades of experience. And maybe this is the time to really push to get that change, to have that change occur, and we now have all this experience. Because that's been a huge problem out there, if you're losing 25% of your credit because of an activity.
Agreed.
Well, speaking of AUL, is a permanent solution with conditions established to be equivalent to an AUL? So is any condition result in a reduction in the tax credit?
I think you guys could correct me, but I don't think so. I think it has to be an AUL. If it's just, right, Larry? Yeah.
About going to meeting with your governor and the staff. I don't know who that guy's name you keep mentioning. He must be somebody high up in the food chain there. Perfect, perfect. So when I became an officer of the New Jersey Builders Association, I'm this year's state president. 5 years ago, I got on the ladder. It's a 5-year stepping up to get to be the president. And I was very interested in more common sense at the Department of Environmental Protection. And fortunately, we had Governor Christie, who came in on a common sense platform, and he put in Commissioner Bob Martin, whose job was to make the Department of Environmental Protection more business friendly and get more stuff done. So we started, every year, we started an initiative, and we assembled a team. We met with him right up front, Commissioner Martin. We told him we wanted to, there's a lot of problems with the way site remediation is managed in New Jersey. It got a lot better. One of the initiatives was we went to a privatized system, and we modeled it after Massachusetts system, by the way. So we now have licensed site remediation professionals in charge of oversight, not the department anymore. They all are licensed by the department, and their license is subject to the department, but they're individual private folks. We then looked at clean fill. There was a huge problem between the suppliers of clean fill and the buyers of clean fill. Licensed quarries that supply clean fill, we found that oftentimes there's naturally occurring elements in that fill, put there by God, who we can't seem to find to send him a fine, and they wouldn't let you test it on their site. If you bought it on their site and brought it to your site and dumped it to use it as a cap, and then you tested it and it had these naturally occurring elements above soil standards, you just became a criminal because you caused the discharge. Long story short, we got together with the quarry operators. We worked it out. We thoroughly vetted it with all the trade groups that were involved on the buy side and the sell side. We now have licensed, virgin, never commingled, quarry-supplied materials in its own category, and it requires no testing for use in brownfield sites. We then went to work on groundwater remediation. The next issue that's about to change is if you're in a site that's been a lot of redevelopment's been going on, a lot of site investigations have been done on groundwater. All the information is in the computer database at the Department of Environmental Protection. They have to give you that data, you can analyze it, and you can come up with what we're calling a virtual classification exception area. So instead of every single property doing a groundwater investigation, coming back and saying it's historically contaminated with the same stuff, or it's salt water, because many of our cities are along saltwater rivers, and the typical remedy would be, okay, file a deed restriction that says it's don't drink the water, do groundwater monitoring for 30 years to show that it's naturally attenuating, take care of any site-specific continuing impacts to the groundwater, and if you have none, then you don't have to worry about it. And everybody had to do this, property by property by property. So now we're about to get approved virtual classification exception areas or sub-regional classification exception areas. And we're working on the first one in downtown Jersey City. We've got all the data. There's been extensive testing of the groundwater aquifer. It's basically all the same stuff down there, plus salt water, because we're on the Hudson River. And when the department, I'm not going to say if, because they are going to agree to this, when the department finally agrees, we're going to have a new protocol that our licensed site professionals can use. And it's going to allow for a limited groundwater investigation. If what's in the groundwater matches what the virtual regional groundwater condition is, you're done. You're still going to file, you don't have to file a classification exception area because there's already a regional classification exception area filed, which incorporates all the property. You don't have to do groundwater monitoring for 30 years, which means you don't have to apply for a permit every 2 years. You don't have to put up a financial surety for the net present value of 30 years of groundwater monitoring costs. Huge improvement in the way we're doing groundwater. Next up is the like-on-like rules. They have this ridiculous rule that if you want to consolidate contaminated materials, it has to be the same type of contaminant that's getting consolidated. It has to be under single ownership or adjacent sites. And it's why? The big question I have is why? I would rather see, if you have 4 city blocks that are all contaminated, why don't we have 3 cleaned up to unrestricted standards, 100% clean, and then the 4th site be the receiving site for the contaminated material that's going to be put under a cap anyway. And on top of that, now that we're all in a FEMA zone, because most of downtown Jersey City and Hoboken was underwater back in March of 2012 in Hurricane Sandy, now all the properties have to be raised to a base flood elevation that varies. You're lifting buildings now between 5 and 8 feet. And if it's a capped site, why couldn't you fill all that extra space going up with contamination from the area and end up with more unrestricted sites? So economic development, that's a good thing. Brownfield redevelopment, that's a good thing. Governors want to see stuff happening. I think it's the right time to go in and start to say, we want to start a common sense committee that's going to straighten out, streamline, lower the cost, and expedite the remediation process. And if you can get their buy-in to that, and they tell you, the commissioner of your Department of Environmental Protection, that they got to start working with this common sense committee, you can get stuff done. And it's going to have lasting benefits for your state if it does. As to the point about why is Boston building like gangbusters, it's very simple. People want to live there, and the prices of real estate are so high that the risk of the environmental costs is a fraction of what the ultimate total value is. Where these tax credit programs come in, and where the environmental risk management process is more important is in places that are not like Boston. I mean, don't get me wrong. If somebody's doing a project in Boston, they should try to get every kind of help they can. Tax credits, loans, grants, whatever you can get, you get. And obviously, you need a team like this to be able to figure that all out. But, you know, in Nowhereville, Pennsylvania, where you got a factory sitting there since the 1800s and it's empty, that's telling you something. The market is not high enough priced for somebody to just walk right in, buy the property, and say, I don't really care if it costs me $1 million or $5 million. It's worth it. So environmental risk management, that's why it has to do with market risk management. You know, in the example here, I want to do a mixed-use development. Well, if it's a renovation job, I got to talk to my contractors, and I got to say, you know, is this going to cost me $100 a square foot, or is this going to be $200 a square foot? At $100 a square foot, it's got a rent for $18, $20 a foot. If it's $200 a square foot, it's got a rent for $25 to $30 a square foot. If I'm building a brand new building and my hard cost is $300 a square foot because it's a high-rise, fully protected structure, I've got a rent for $40, $45 a square foot. So market risk has everything to do with, and market risk subtract construction. You got to know what your construction costs are. Then you can subtract environmental risk, and this all goes back to the finance numbers. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just explaining how a capital stack works, because I've got to have a bank loan. That's going to put 75% of the total capital I need. I may need a mezzanine lender to reduce the amount of equity. Mezz lenders will take you from 70% up to 85, 90% of the total capital stack. Then I'm with all equity. I'm with investors at that point. Somewhere's around 85 to 100% of the capital stack, I need equity capital. It's the only place you're going to fill that layer. The equity capital guys are going to say, well, all right, I'll put up 80, 90% of it, but then you, the developer, has to have skin in the game. They're looking for me to put up 10 or 20% of the money. So the capital stack in terms of risk goes from the bottom to the top. The bottom, the biggest amount of the capital, 70, 75%, is the bank. And it's the cheapest money out there because it's got all the other layers of the capital stack ahead of it when there's a loss. It's like when you have your auto insurance policy, there's a deductible. You pay the first $500 when you crash, and then insurance kicks in. Well, in real estate, it's the same thing. The bank wants to know that they're going to do 65, 70% of the total capitalization, because ahead of them is the other 25, 30, 35% of the funds. If there's a loss on the project, all those higher levels, my money goes first. I'm at the top of the stack. 1%, let's call it $100. One of those dollars is mine. 9 or so of those is equity investors. That's the top 10 bucks of the $100 capital stack. The next 20 or 25 bucks is going to probably be a mezzanine lender who comes in at that higher level because he charges you a lot more of interest, but he doesn't take any of the profit, which is why you use a mezz lender. It's cheaper capital if the project is successful. And then at the bottom of the stack, and the largest amount, the 7 bucks out of 10 bucks, is your bank. So when you're talking about risk, your most expensive capital is the first capital in. Your investors are the ones, me first, I'm going to do this preliminary due diligence. And for me, preliminary due diligence is basically making WAGs into SWAGs. WAGs are wild-ass guesses, and that's how I start every project. I take a look at a building, I know what their asking price is, I try to figure out what the rents are, I try to figure out what it's going to cost me. If there's environmental information I can gather, I try to guess what that's going to cost, and I do a very simple pro forma. That's a wild-ass guess. If that makes sense, I go to the next stage. I start hiring experts like these guys. I have my construction manager come in. I spend time driving around the market with a real estate broker who knows the market. So I'm trying to ascertain, I'm trying to get more science into the numbers, make that WAG into a SWAG, a scientific wild-ass guess. And these guys are going to help me. They're going to talk about what's it going to cost to investigate, what's it going to cost to remediate, what do we think the problems are going to be, and you're constantly moving from wild-ass guess to more and more certainty. As you move across that risk spectrum to try to get more scientific data and less WAG and more SWAG, that costs me money. So the better my investigation, the better my experts, the more experience they have, the faster I'm going to move through that stage. And when you're talking to the first part of the whole process, which is site control, the most important part of that is, what does the seller want out of the transaction? Does the seller want to sell as fast as he can and get out of Dodge? Every seller wants to do that. In a remediation, the reason I like brownfield remediation is because it's pretty easy to convince the seller that there's nobody there ready to write you a big check and take all your problems away. Because if that had happened, I probably wouldn't be there talking to them. It would be gone already. If you had a property in a super hot location in downtown Boston, somebody had an old parking lot with a gas station and it's zoned 50 stories, those sites go like that. There's no environmental liability transfer. There's very little negotiation. If a developer finds a guy that's been there forever and just wants a decent sized checks and go retire in Florida, it's gone. It happens. You know, in Nowhereville, Massachusetts, where there's been a factory sitting around for 100 years and nobody's taken it on yet, everybody's come, looked at it, tied it up, walked away. Come, look at it, tied up, walked away. Those are the opportunities. Those are where you're going to get the guy to spend time. He's going to, if you need a year and you're willing to pay the investigation, really try to figure out how to finance the deal, really try to figure out what the market wants that project to be. What can you afford to spend? And ultimately, there's going to be a gap. I can almost guarantee you the reason that building is still sitting there, the reason that contaminated site is still there undeveloped, is because there's a gap. There's a gap between the revenue the market's willing to pay and the cost of the project. It's underwater. It's backwards. And that's where tax credits come in, expedited zoning, variances, parking reductions. There's a whole bunch of ways you can close that gap. And putting a team together to get you to the point where you can identify what the gap is really the first thing you have to do, because then you can figure out, okay, now we know that this thing is underwater, it's going to need X amount of subsidy. How do we plug that gap? How do we put profit back into the project? And a landowner who's underwater like that is a perfect client for me, because he's going to give me time. And the one thing I need to figure it out, to get those WAGs to SWAGs, is I need time. And that's where value is created. Rather than somebody just saying, your property's worth nothing. You pay me and I'll take it away. And there's guys in the business, some of the ELT, the Environmental Liability Transfer Companies, some of the biggest ones in the country, that's what they do. They'll have a big a chemical company or a factory company, they'll say, look, we know the liability is $10 million and the property isn't worth a thing. We'll write you a check for $10 million. You take the property, you deal with it, you make sure we're indemnified. These are companies with fairly good-sized balance sheets and insurance behind them. And they'll backstop that liability transfer with a balance sheet and sometimes insurance too. And they'll walk away with the site. And they make their money because if it's a $10 million cleanup, they might be able to get it done for $8. So, so that's really a little more in-depth of this risk management process that goes on, and why identifying properties like some of your clients have that they seem to be more stuck with requires the kind of expertise that me and a team like these guys can bring to the table to figure it out.
We need more of you in Massachusetts.
No, just a comment, and this goes to this gentleman here. It seems to me this tax credit program needs a sliding scale like we have in the 40B process, whereby you get a bigger tax credit out somewhere like Holyoke or Fitchburg or something to get these abandoned properties developed, which many times are underwater, as opposed to Boston, which frankly probably doesn't need a tax credit. When you know, when the worth of a parking space is $250,000. I looked at a client on a quarter-acre property, wanted to build residential. Said, you don't want to dig on this property. It's all ash and crud under there. We've done some borings. He says, how much is it going to cost to get rid of that? I said, $250,000, $500,000 maybe. He goes, good. That's 2 parking spaces. I paid for it. You know, if I can get 10 more under that building, forget about it. I mean, it's, but you go out to Fitchburg, and the property's worth comparatively nothing.
And I think part of the process, what Warren was talking about before, was that it sounds almost like it's a negotiation. And if you've got a government that is really trying to get development going and really trying to get the economic engine revved up, and you're in one of these marginal properties, you're going to have a much better time negotiating a much better tax credit deal, because you're just going to tell them, look, I need to put, use his example, I need to put an underground garage in this property. And I've delineated the property vertically and horizontally, and I've got a model that shows the entire area where this garage is going to get dug out is contaminated. I need 100% credit for the excavation. I need to get paid for the slab at the bottom of the hole, which is going to cap this site. But for this kind of help, this project is going to stay here forever. The owner may go bankrupt, it become an orphan site, and then you, Mr. Regulator, now it's your problem. And that's why you got to talk to these guys sometimes.
Is it negotiable? Is it negotiable, or is it that flat 20 and 50%, depending A well, no A well? Is that across the board, or do we have negotiation in this that I can bring a client to and say, hey, they can push for 60, 80, maybe 100% tax credit if they do this cleanup in Pittsburgh?
Yeah.
Okay, that's
But I think
I would do it. I would go negotiate.
I think it's a good, I mean, it's possible that we could talk to them and tell them that something's going to come in, and that this, you know, identify it and tell them what it's going to be, and speak to them.
They're talking to the leader about one in Pittsburgh again. You know, it's $100+ grand to clean it up, and they're going to need a bigger tax credit to make it happen.
Not that.
That's targeted to that project.
I don't know. That's this. You know, I'm.
That's the kind of stuff they can do. They can do tax, they can do property tax relief, they can support you, they can have the selectmen and your assemblyman and your senator and your rep. They should all write letters when you go into the DEP that we want this project, we need this project, it's got a gap in financing, and here's how we propose to plug it, and here's what we need you, Mr. DEP tax credit review guy, to do about it. You gotta build your case. It's like you're going in front of a judge. You gotta do your homework and write your briefs.
We just kicked off your client about $10,000 worth of upfront payments to have an attorney go.
Your client's underwater. Your client's underwater, stuck in wind. What does he want to do? Pay an attorney to try to rescue him, throw him a life raft, or just sink to the bottom?
If you don't have the $10,000 to begin with, you're in trouble.
That's great.
Part of the problem that we have here in the state, we have a lot of good programs. We acquired an old high school from the city of Worcester, and we're a nonprofit, so we we don't have the end user. We buy the sites, clean them up on spec, and make them pad ready, and then work with the city to attract end users because they don't want to deal with all this complication. We're trying to get the pad ready site to the market faster. But part of the problem that we have in the state is that, and this is I'm not even going to exaggerate, but I'm going to think I'm exaggerating. The high school had underground storage tanks, and they had contaminated the historic part of the property under the foundation, which was a problem. We were trying to convert the high school into, it was historic, and we were trying to convert it into housing. So there's a vapor barrier, and I stay away from the chemistry. They just let me do the development, but it wasn't going to work. So it was a complicated piece to try to get the contamination out and then capped and protected so that the vapors didn't affect the housing. So the old high school was full of asbestos, and it had underground, it had soil contamination, and it had lead paint. So we acquired the piece, we put it in the nonprofit from the city, took a promissory note back, and now we got to figure out how to eliminate the risk, right, so that we can get the developer comfortable, so that all the things you're talking like a true developer, we've got to get all those resolved so that the developer can evaluate the risk and go get their financing. What happened was the asbestos program had to be awarded to a redevelopment authority implemented by Mass Development. The soil money that was coming from the EPA had to go to a nonprofit. And the other program, as part of the $1.5 million cleanup, had to go to a CDC, Community Development Corporation. So the property would have had to transfer 3 times in order to qualify for all the different phases, all the different programs that are allowed to the state, rather than just say, let's stop all this nonsense, responsible party. If you truly want, the end goal is to get the property back into productive use, pick the entity, understand that the responsible party is, in this case it was the city. So we want to get it back into productive use rather than sitting there. We really have to consolidate all this thinking about, this has to go to a CDC, this has to go to a redevelopment authority, this program fits that. It goes to the project, is what it really needs to. It has to figure out a way to streamline it. I would go so far to say if there's some type of an MOU, it should go to the developer. It should go to the developer, monitored by the city or whatever, so that the funds are expended properly. But we really got to start to cut through all that, because that's we got to get the properties to the market faster, not be going through all these steps with the various programs.
I agree.
It's really about education. I mean, there's all kinds of different avenues. I look at it as there are developers that are in the marketplace. They understand the environmental risks. They understand the challenges, and they figure it out. You get guys out, companies out there that just want to buy vanilla, and they just don't have the appetite for something, or the capital to do it. And I think it's a focus. I think it's a focus on educating those that have the ability to do it, but haven't figured out how to do it, and what all of the things that are available to them.
Here is exactly, all right, we're in a gateway city. Gateway cities don't include Boston. So the gateway cities, there's not enough value that the tax credit alone can close the gap.
In some cases.
So you've got to use all these other.
That's right, and you still see development in those areas, and that it's really just figuring out, where you can maximize your effort.
The worse off a community is, the more they should want to help on a situation like you're describing. So, as you go further and further away from Boston and from, $800 a square foot condo prices and $40 a square foot rental prices, the further you go away from there, I think the more opportunity there is to engage with government. What you're talking about is political leadership. That's what you're talking about here. And, we could talk all day about that. But that's what you got to have happen. You got to have the wind at your back politically if you're going to make these really challenged sites ever get redeveloped.
Ed had a question.
Warren, you had mentioned that clean fill. once I excavate, let's say I excavate 3,000 yards of soil, get rid of all this contaminated soil, can I put in clean fill? I'm gonna have to bring it back up to grade. Can that be put in under the tax credit?
Well, that's a cost, yeah.
I want to ask some of the LSPs and environmental consultants, do you have clients that face issues like this or what they're talking about up there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We work on two of them together.
Yeah.
There was a question down here, Melina.
Yeah.
This guy in the front row.
I have a question about urban fill that's not necessarily an MCP site. You know, we have to, it's not regulated, but it's expected that you take care of it properly. You can't make another disposal site. You know, you have background concentrations of arsenic or, you know, coal ash and stuff like that on the site. You can't just bring it to someone's backyard and put it as spill. That, I assume that would not be able to receive a tax credit at this time because it's not an MCP site.
It has to be reported, and then it has to generate an RTN.
Yeah. But that's a significant cost to a lot of these development projects.
Correct.
You can remove 75,000 cubic yards of soil, that's just marginally impacted, but it's not otherwise a reportable release.
But that goes to what we were talking about, if you refer to asbestos abatement and things like that. This particular tax credit is just one of the criteria is that you only get the tax credit once you have this permanent solution with or without conditions. And then pre-existing, it has to be a reportable condition per the MCP and generate the RTN. So if you have things like coal ash or asbestos abatement, that those are not part of this tax credit. Although if there was a scenario that required a reportable condition and you did therefore get your RTN and as part of your plan, those kind of costs were part of the plan. It's possible that you could piggyback those. And the example is the demolition of the building and the asbestos abatement.
Yeah.
Yes, Ed.
So if you were doing an excavation, you found some, came across a pocket where there was some illegally dumped asbestos material in the soil, it may be covered with the tax credit, but it would have to be a notifiable condition.
It's a tough, the word may. The word may has to be in there, but it's factual. By itself, asbestos abatement is not part of the costs of this tax credit, but.
But if it's the source of what you found in the ground, in other words, under the MCP, you have to clean up the source. So you find, I got a building that's filled with asbestos, okay? I take whatever my RQ is, I spread it around the building. Oh, I got asbestos in the dirt, okay? I notify the DPP, I get an RTN. Now is my whole building abatement getting rid of the source? I'm sort of making a little silly question here, but the point is, at what point, I mean, that's usually a very, very big expense in your overall brownfields redevelopment. Is that asbestos, PCB, lead paint abatement for a building even before you demo it. And that's one of the biggest expenses on a lot of brownfield properties. Far exceeding maybe some oil cleanup or something like that, that if it could be somehow worked into that brownfield tax credit, it would be huge. But you know, you take an old mill building and haul a lot of that junk out of there, that's a lot of money.
It is.
It's a lot of money.
So what's the answer?
Well,
Can we include it?
it's a silly.
Because I have the same problem. I have a building that has to be taken down. It's got asbestos, it's got some mercury in it, it's got some stuff, and that all has to be disposed of as part of the demolition of the building. And there's an area of concern under the building. So is the remediation of the stuff in the building all by itself eligible? Or would we have to make an argument that we have to take the building down to get to the stuff under the building, and then the stuff in the building is eligible.
That's the argument.
That's the argument.
That's the way you got to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
A question about sort of non-traditional remediation approach, if you will. DEP is developing new policies for, we've been talking around it a little bit, filling in quarries, gravel sites, et cetera, with regulated soils. And/or in the case of, say, a landfill closure, say an unlined landfill closure. From your experience, Warren, if we brought material in to grade and shape or close a site, which might have a post-closure use, such as a solar farm or ball field recreational facilities, although it isn't a 21E site, regulated under another program, have you had the experience with applying tax credits to that form of a mitigation or remediation?
I didn't hear. Can
Like I
we
said,
get the question?
You're capping a landfill, and you're bringing in clean fill, and you're going to do either a solar farm or a baseball field. Is the clean fill eligible for tax credits?
Or even if it's mildly contaminated soils that are regulated under DEP policy, would the act of remediating and the cost associated with that covered in some sort of tax?
Well, on this tax credit, again, it would have to be, it's only for the reportable conditions to DEP. In terms of the subsequent use and the solar example, there is categories in the production tax credits for in this state, the SRECs, the solar renewable energy certificates are rated based on the different properties. So if you're citing solar on the top of what was formerly a Brownfields site, then you get a factor 1 SREC, and that will lead you to greater tax credits. So there's different tax credits possibilities, but in terms of that environmental and the soil, it has to be a reportable condition per MCP and reported to DEP. Otherwise, no.
I have a question on, what's the window of opportunity if a site was closed out with an RAO, a couple of years back, and no tax credit has been taken? When does the window close on being able to apply for that tax credit?
The tax credit is issued for the year in which the permanent solution or ROS was achieved. So if that was and it's a 5-year tax credit. So in this example, assuming it was 2013, it's a 2013 tax credit going to 2018, no matter when you file. So if we're now in 2015, we file, and it takes them 9 months to approve this, and we're into 2016, then that credit has already run 3 of its 5 years. And so in terms of usability of that credit, you can only transfer what you have available. And so as a taxpayer, as that taxpayer that's earned that tax credit, you can utilize 3/5 of that tax credit, go back and amend tax returns and utilize that tax credit on your own returns. If you wanted to monetize it and sell it to a third party, which is allowable under the statute, you could only sell 2/5 of that credit. Does that help? Okay.
Clarify the 5 years, and is that true when the dollars were spent, when the RAO or the permanent solution is issued?
When the permanent solution is issued. So,
The dollars may have been spent several years.
correct. So if you've got achievement of your RAO in 2013, then that's when that tax credit would be. However, if you're filing for an ROS and you've done that in 2012, it's not for an ROS. It's not. It's when you first file it. It's a little illogical, so it's... Yeah, but the statute says permanent solution or ROS. But then there's a 2013 directive that says that the ROS is considered to be achieved when you first file it, and then all the 6-month filings that you have to make afterwards is just to maintain it. And the tax credit is for achieving the solution, not maintaining it. So it will be then, your tax credit is the date of your permanent solution, what was the RAO previously, or ROS filing.
So it's whatever was spent up to that ROS filing.
Well, so what, the statute was enacted 1998, and that's another one of these black and white rules. So if you have any spending that predates 1998, then that's out. But so technically, if you've got a site that you achieved your RAO, and I don't want to get too technical, but you have to achieve it after 2006. So if you started spending money in 1999 and you actually got your permanent solution in 2014, you can technically go back to 99, and all that spending through the date of achievement is part of your tax credit. But if you, in 1999, you started spending money and you got your permanent solution in 2006 or 2005, you're out of luck, and 5 years beyond that. So yeah.
So let me talk about structuring transactions with property owners. I think it's important that you guys understand that your client, I'm taking the standpoint now that you represent the landowner, the contaminated site owner. Understanding a little bit about how a capital stack works, and that at the lower levels of the stack, there's much less risk and also much less reward. You can borrow construction money now at 4%. And at the very top of the capital stack, where the risk is highest, you make the most money. My investors typically make 10% or more on a preferred return, which is like an interest rate that accrues on their money, plus a huge chunk of the profit. Could be 50% if it's a 50-50 split, could be higher, could be 80-20. They could get 80% of the profits over their 10% preferred return. The difference in those types of returns is entirely dependent on how risky the investor thinks the investment is. And so the later you can bring an investor into a deal, and the more of the risk you could have managed, either reduced or eliminated, the cheaper cost of capital that somebody like me is going to be able to get. So for a landowner to work with a developer, there's great amount of value to that, and you can pay the landowner more for that value. So there's basically 3 ways a landowner can work with a developer. The first, and this goes in order of magnitude of risk. So the least risky way is for the landowner to give the developer time. If he lets me sign a contract and he gives me a year or 2 years or 3 years, and he allows me to have certain contingencies, like I'm going to want to ask for a zoning contingency, and I'll give myself 6 or 12 months to achieve zoning. Then I'm going to want an environmental due diligence contingency, and I'll give myself 3, 6, 9 months to get environmental due diligence done. And then if he'll give me a further amount of time, I typically don't ask for a financing contingency, because then the seller says, what, after you got everything done, you don't even know if you got the money? And I'm pretty confident that I can raise capital once these other risks are out of the way, or at least seriously reduced. So I don't typically ask for an environmental contingency, but it's not out of the question. I mean, a financial contingency, but it's not out of the question. So if a seller is willing to give me time and give me contingencies that I have to achieve in a logical sequence, like entitlements first, environmental second, then that has great value to me. Because if I had to buy that property up front with all that risk, it would cost me minimum 10% a year, minimum 10% a year. So if he's asking me $3 million for a piece of property, for example, and he'll give me a year, I'll pay $3.3 million. because I would have handed that to an investor, plus a huge chunk of the profit. So if I just hand him 10% on the purchase price for the year and none of the profit, I'm ahead by that chunk of the profit. I'll end up maybe, instead of giving the investor 80% of the profit that I would have had to promise them to come in up front when it was a much riskier deal, a year or two from now, when I've isolated those risks, he may only do a 50-50 deal with me. He may say, you did a great job. We've got a buyer lined up. We know what our costs are. We know what our environmental is. We know we're allowed to do what we want to do. You take 75% of the profit. I'll charge you 12 pref and 25% of the profit. So isn't it worth it for me to pay that landowner more money each year he lets me have control? And my incentive to move faster is I'd rather buy the property for less than for more. So if I have 2 years and each year the price goes up 10%, I'd rather get everything done in 1 year, but I might need 2. So you negotiate a long-term purchase contract with price adjustments, with contingencies to manage risk. Another one of my favorite things to do is to do formula pricing. Formula pricing is great because it protects everybody. Formula pricing is based on zoning yield. So you can tell the guy, if he's asking $3 million, I'll say, and then let's say that I'm willing to pay $100,000 per apartment, then I need 30 apartments approved on the property. So I'll tell him, okay, it's $3 million subject to me getting 30 apartments zoned for the property. Every unit above 30 units, we'll split it. We'll add 50 grand to the price. You make 50,000, I save 50,000. So formula pricing, everybody's in on the upside. He's covered on the downside. He's got his minimum purchase price, and he's making more money on the upside. Everybody's in it together. So long-term purchase contracts, contingencies, formula pricing, annual escalators, these are things you can do for a land seller that needs a developer to work together. The second way to control property is to, and again, a little more risky, have the seller finance the transaction. The seller can finance a transaction at different ways. He can take, the least risky way is to give you a first mortgage on the property. So again, you put down 10%, he takes back a mortgage for 90%. You can make it an accrual note, the interest accrues to some point. You can put a balloon on it. You could say, I only need you to carry the mortgage for 3 years, 4 years, because when you have a first mortgage on a property, it's really only a bridge loan. I'm ultimately going to have to bring in a construction lender, and he's going to want the first mortgage on the property. So at the point where you're really ready to break ground, you're shovel ready, you've got zoning, environmental, you've got your building permits, you've done your market studies, you know exactly what you want to build, and you're ready to break ground. You close your construction loan, you bring in your equity partner. Now your equity partner is saying, wow, this deal's all teed up. He's not going to charge me much at all, my equity investor. And then you take out the seller's first mortgage. The seller's completely protected. He's got your deposit, and if you can't pay him off when the note's due, he takes the property back, and you've added a whole bunch of value through this risk management process for him. He's way better off than he was before he met you. So the second way is to finance the transaction with a first mortgage. Better for me and a little bit more risky, but potentially more reward for him, would be to take a first mortgage and then subordinate it. Go to a mezzanine position, which is an unsecured note. Now, instead of a 5% first mortgage, you could pay him 10, 12, 15% on that mortgage. If you paid him the note and you put the money in the bank's going to give you a very generous 0.5, 0.75% interest rate. You make nothing after inflation and after taxes, zero. You're losing money on putting money in the bank. So you try to tell him, look, the developer's done all this work. It's completely teed up. He's got his construction loan. Environmental's done. Entitlement's done. It's ready to build. Subordinate to the construction loan and convert that 4%, 5% first mortgage to a 10 or 15% mezz loan. It's another way to participate. So financing the deal either in a senior position or a junior position or a mezz position can make him a whole lot more money on that project. And that whole lot more money, another way to do it is, rather than a high interest rate on the loan he's going to finance you with, increase the purchase price by what the interest would have been, because now he gets to pay capital gains rates on that income. If he takes back a note at a 15% mezz rate, that mezz interest rate is ordinary income to him. So he's going to pay ordinary income taxes. So reduce the rate on the note and increase the purchase price where he's paying capital gains rates. So tax planning, working with a landowner is another way to do it. So A, long-term contract control. B, finance the transaction through some form of seller financing. Or C, become an equity investor. Take some or all of the purchase price and invest it in the deal. Now you're going to earn the same preferred return that the investment capital earns, and you're going to get a big chunk of the profit at the end of the day, whatever percentage your land investment is of the total equity investment. That's your piece of the profit. So you'll get a preferred return of 10 or 12%, and you'll get 10, 20, 30, 40% of the profit. The highest return to a landowner is to become an investor with his land in a deal. So the conversation you have with the property owner up front is, particularly a guy who's been stuck with a piece of property for a long time, is you really need to team up with a developer. You need to team up with a developer who knows how to manage risk and get the deal done. And there's a whole bunch of ways you can participate with that developer and make much more money than what if somebody even was willing to write you a check up front. And like I said before, if somebody was willing to write a check up front, the property's a high value piece of property and you don't need anybody like me. That property's going to go like that. But for a property that's stuck either under the water or marginally close above water, maybe the water level is just below the guy's nostrils, he needs to work with a developer. He needs to work with somebody and reduce risk and figure out a way to plug a financial gap and monetize that piece of property. And you guys that are working with these landowners and the kinds of situations that have been described by some of you guys, it sounds to me like those landowners need to have a fresh approach to exiting that piece of property. And you guys can be the guys that advise them on exactly how to do that. It's a developer that knows what he's talking about. It's an environmental lawyer. It's a licensed site remediation professional. It's an insurance guy. It's a tax credit guy. It's a team of people coming together and focusing on it within the context of what the landowner's exit strategy is. And sometimes they don't even understand they have options. Sometimes they don't even know there's probably 5 or 6 ways out of that deal. They're just thinking, God, I've hired 3 brokers. He made a really nice book with really pretty pictures, and nobody's bought my property. What's wrong? He's not approaching it right. If the property could have sold, it would have sold the first time he listed with a broker. That's his signal that he's got to change his game plan. But a lot of times they don't even know there is another game plan.
George, when you mentioned that you holding, in that scenario, that you're holding off as long as possible, bringing in your equity, are you covering those soft costs yourself, or how are you generally dealing with soft costs?
Yeah, I'm usually paying the soft costs up front. What I do is I have vendors that I work with. And a lot of times, particularly the larger the deal, the more likely you're going to get vendors to help you in the beginning, when you're at the very early stages, to work with you, help you get through some of the due diligence, because they're investing in the deal. And I basically tell them, look, you work with me up front, and what you're really doing is you're investing in the deal. Mm-hmm. And I will give them a payment at a point where we've actually raised capital. I'll give them the option to convert the payment into equity in the deal. So if they think the deal's a real winner, they could say, don't pay me. I'm going to put what I would have billed you into the deal as an investor. We open a capital account for them, and they're an investor. We typically accrue interest on the bill at a very good rate, a much better rate than if they got paid and paid taxes on it and stuck it in the bank or something. That's all the upside. The downside is if the deal crashes and burns, everybody loses. I lost what I spent. They lost their services that they put into the deal. So it doesn't work for every vendor, and it doesn't work in every circumstance. But one of the ways I will try to finance upfront due diligence costs is by working with vendors and service providers. I also tell people that if you're a vendor, if you're a service provider, and you bring me a deal, you get the work. It's like a no-bid contract. And because I have teams of consultants that I've worked with in New Jersey and up here in Massachusetts, with Dave's firm, with that we have very long-term relationships, and they're bringing me projects. Dave's firm actually does environmental liability transfer. They've taken factory sites and they've said to the property owner, you transfer title to the property to us, we'll take care of all the remediation work, we'll indemnify you, you walk away scot-free, and then they clean it up, and then typically they come to me for the ultimate exit strategy. So they do the environmental part, I do the land development part, and I position the property. I also work for landowners as a consultant, because a lot of times a landowner says, oh my God, here comes a developer, all he's trying to do is take my pants down. And so I say, look, I'm happy to work as a land developer, which puts me on your side of the table. We will manage risk together, we will position the property together, and then we will find a developer who wants to step in when he's ready to break ground. I'm working with Toll Brothers on a piece of property. I've talked to Pulte. These large, high-volume production builders don't want to go through entitlement risk, environmental risk. Sometimes they don't want to do utility risk, like if you don't have sewer or water and you've got to drill wells or design and permit package plants. They don't want to do any of that because they've got a stock price that's dependent on starts. That's what they need. They need starts. And so they will pay retail price for a lot that is ready to build. So if I come in and I say to a property owner, let's work together and get to the property, get this property to the point where we've got fully zoned, fully cleaned up, entitled, subdivided lots ready to build, they'll pay top dollar for those things because they need starts. That's what they need. That's what drives their stock price. So the larger the site and the more you can work with the property owner, and I'm happy to work with the property owner as his partner, consultant, I don't really care what you call me. I want to be able to agree on something, get the job done, and make a nice paycheck for me and the landowner. But there's great value in positioning property for development. That's what a land developer does.
George, what's your minimum size project that you'd like to work on dollar-wise?
That's a good question. You know, it relates to the aspirin factor. Every project's got headaches. You're going to have to take aspirins, and you better be a significant number of zeros after the first number on the check, or it's not really worth it. So I would say probably 100 units, something 100. You know, I prefer 500. I have 2,300 units in development in Jersey City right now. The one I'm doing in Massachusetts is 450. I've one I'm working with Dave's company in Pennsylvania right now. That's 325. That's 192. There's one in New Jersey. I'm working with a property owner, an old textile mill. That'll be 325. It's all the same process. So it's not that one's harder than the other or more complex. It's just that it's the aspirin factor.
How big are these acres, size lots? Is it, you said something about 6 to 9 months on the environmental due diligence. Is that typical, or?
It just doesn't really seem to be a typical. I think you can probably investigate your average large site in 6 to 9 months site investigation. I think that's reasonable.
You get a lot done.
You can get a lot done in that amount of time. Yeah, and I think that goes to the thoroughness of the investigation too. If you really hit it hard, and you know, instead of doing 2 bores per acre, you do 6. You really crisscross it, and you go at different depths. You get it done faster because you don't have to go back.
Bill, here's a loaded question. As an attorney and a former state employee, what do you think of that approach of pre-discussing with the state that a big project may be coming in and that we're likely to come in for tax credits, and we'd like as much as we can get?
I think it depends on the agency and who you can get to within the agency. And I don't think, my experience has been that, especially in the program I ran, that you don't like to give upfront determinations because, a state agency always reserves the right to change their mind later. And if you can get in there, great, but I don't think you're going to get anything that they, especially if the regulatory or statutory authority doesn't allow for it. I don't think you're going to get them to commit to anything in writing.
Oh, no, no.
But, talk is always cheap, and if you can get it, sure, but I think you have to go in there with a low expectation.
George, just one quick question. The preferred, when you talk about a 10% preferred, when is that paying? At what point do you start?
Yeah,
When you collect the money prior to partnership, or are you paying that, at what point do
It's
you
an
start?
accrual. So the order of distributions, the priority of distributions at the end of a deal goes from the bottom to the top. So the bank who lends you the 75%, who has the first mortgage, he gets paid first. Your mezz lender, who's somewhere between 70 and 90%, he gets paid second. Your investor and you, me, who's putting up, the investor's putting up 80, 90% of that top layer of the capital stack, and I'm putting up 10 or 20%. That's a negotiation. Whether he gets paid first or we get paid together is a negotiation between me and the investor. I generally like pari passu, which is what they call, everybody gets it in the same order of what they put it in. So if it's a 90-10, your bank's paid off, your mezz lender's paid off, now you're distributing the final profits of the deal, and he put up 90 and I put up 10, then he gets 90 and I get 10 of those distributions as that last revenue comes into the deal. So the preferred return on the equity investment is an accrual, and it gets paid after all the debt's been paid.
Alton?
Technical, this is largely focused, and I appreciate it, on tax credits, financing, arranging a project. Some of us in this audience are technical people, LSPs, engineers, who are responsible for getting the work done, typically here under MCP and 21E. Are there things that we need to be aware of? Difficulties, higher standards, lower standards for us, a number of samples we need to take? Are there any sort of technical regulations in this whole Brownsfield program that we need to be aware of? I mean, at one time I thought someone said you got relaxation in the MCP risk characterization standards. I understand now that may not be the case. But are there other things like this that we need to be in know of when we go out and do our work, or do we do it just like we would do any other project?
In order to be eligible for the tax credits in Massachusetts, you have to be compliant with the MCP.
So that's it?
That's it.
Okay. No bonuses, no benefits, no nothing else.
Let me tell you another thing you're not thinking about. You're thinking like a technician.
Oh, yeah.
You need to know what the exit strategy for the property is. So you need to understand what the seller is trying to do, if the seller can exit the property on his own, or you need to know what the developer, the ultimate reuser of the property, is going to want to do. Because otherwise, I don't even know how you figure out what you technicians are going to be doing, and you don't know either or both of those factors. So I guess you guys do this when you first sit down with your client. I don't know, because I'm not in your business. But you really need to know what the seller's expectations are.
I just want to clarify what I said too. Of course, you can't be the polluter.
No, I understand.
Okay.
And I understand what this gentleman's saying,
Yep.
that what the client wants to do with the property, to a certain sense, depends on how disciplined or detailed we get in our contamination assessment. Obviously, if he's going to use it for industrial, we're not going to maybe do as much soil sampling as we would be for residential or school or something of that nature. Fair enough. But other than that, it's just, as the MCP, as the other gentleman said, there's nothing special about Brownsfields that applies to us from a regulatory standpoint.
In Massachusetts, they specifically, you have two agencies that you're dealing with. You have the Environmental Regulatory Community, DEP, and you have the DOR. And that used to be extremely frustrating, but guys like Warren made that a whole lot less frustrating by working very closely with the consultants. But the DOR is not going to give you any money unless you're compliant with 21E.
Well, I mean, it's just that a client's coming to me and said, what do I have to do for Brownsfield? You're an LSP. As if there's some big technical new thing I have to do, and I tell them, no, it's all a matter of financing and tax credits, and you need to speak to that type of a real estate attorney or someone who knows that end of the business. I can give you some rough ideas. yeah, you get a tax credit, but it's not really within the technical engineering realm per se.
Bill, I have a question for you
There's a
based on all of
question.
this.
Just to kind of follow up, you, both Warren and Paul, you mentioned earlier about, you know, the wording of things and reports going into DEP. And we talked about the issue of when you take ownership and whether or not the credits apply to you. But have you seen instances where you follow the MCP, you are working for the owner, they're the ones incurring the costs, that a consultant has been tripped up by the way they worded something in their documentation going into DEP and DOR's interpretation of that? Do you have any specific examples of where that has become a problem?
Yeah, where'd you really screw up, guys?
You know, I've seen where Phil, for instance, because of ignorance, not capturing tax credits. You know, working with folks on Melina's team, for instance, if she's in the process early enough and the consultant's working with her, you're not going to miss those things because she's excellent at what she does. If you're not, and you're just hoping that you got everything, she's probably going to come to you when you bring her in the process late and say, geez, I wish you had brought us in earlier because here's a whole bunch of stuff you likely would have not missed.
I would say specifically, if he's willing to speak, but my good friend sitting at the back of the room, Rick Cote, Comprehensive Environmental, there's a particular site in Dedham, Massachusetts that we've been working on for 4 years. We approached DOR and we were denied on this owner/lessee interpretation of the statute. We came back. We ran into an issue about how DEP defines site parameters because our site extended onto several other properties, so we had expenses spilling over onto other people's properties. We have an issue right now with $1.3 million of costs where we did spend the money. And technically you'll be able to explain it better than me, but there was a downhill gradient and our contamination flowed, and we made several deals. One was purchasing equipment, and the other was actually paying for the remediation costs. And DOR hasn't been inclined to approve that based on the way it was presented and detailed at that point in time. So had we been able to word it differently, I think we would have had an easier time proving what we're trying to prove. Does that give you any light? Okay.
Yes.
George, or maybe others, when you talked about some of the bigger buildings like Toll or Pulte, how do they view brownfields versus greenfields? Is there still an inclination to skip over the brownfields? Because ideally, we'd like to see those go first. But
You guys have experience with that? I think they prefer unrestricted cleanups, but they're not adverse to a restricted cleanup if it's a market that they think is particularly hot, that they're, interested in. I think some of it has to do with how busy they are. They always want to do more starts this year than they did last year, because probably their bonus is tied to that. So if you get them early in the year, they may be a little more aggressive. If it's late in the year, they already know they're 20% ahead of last year. They may say, come back and talk to me next year. It's really a little bit specific to where they are in their cycle and where the market is. I mean, if I was in downtown Boston, I think they'd be all over it, restricted or not. But as you move further away from the really hot markets, I think they get more picky.
Melina, didn't you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Bill, when we were on the topic of what the LSP should be doing, your in-house counsel at ECS, what would you advise?
With respect to it, what exactly? Because the LSP does everything. I rely on LSPs daily. As far as cleaning up the site, well, ultimately the objective here is to get the exemptions under 21E. from, somebody like George's perspective, and that's, obviously the responsibility of the LSP. And I think it's important for clear understanding of what the roles and responsibilities are. George has offered great insight here. I mean, a lot of times we'll do deals, and the client only wants a phase one site assessment. And even in cases where there are recs identified, they may not choose to go to that phase two. And again, we're not talking as large-scale projects of this magnitude, but the LSP, to me, it's very important that you speak and write what actually exists. And I'm an engineer from undergraduate perspective, and I don't think I really learned how to write until I went to law school, because my biggest challenge is, and no offense to the audience, but my biggest challenge is getting the engineer or the LSP to say what they actually mean. They're a lot of genius up there, but getting it on paper and making it clear to the reader and the ultimate person that may be suing you is a very important thing.
Yes.
Looking down the road, are there going to be any changes in the Brownfields tax credit program, with a new administration? I mean, not asking you fortune tellers or anything, but anything that we should consider in the near future with the program changing at all?
Well, the federal program expired, and I don't think it's going to be renewed. I can't remember the name of it, 181 or something, but whatever, it's gone.
Well, in Massachusetts, the program was set to sunset in 2013, and previously it had been given 2-year extensions each time, so it was 2007 became 09, 11, 13. In 13, they gave it 5 years, which is obviously the first time they've ever done that. It's a longer period of time, but we're seeing that internally, because of these loopholes or tax credits that may have been issued previously that shouldn't have been, the state is holding on very tightly, and so this issue that we've been raising of inequality or unequal application of the rules is the big issue that we see. So I mean, it's just one person's opinion, but yes, internally there may be some kind of a informal mandate to slow these things down and make sure that we know what's going on internally at the state level, and I don't think that has to do with this particular administration. But we're still 4 years out until this expires. So I don't.
You're going to work on that legislative change for the building material inclusion, right?
Yeah, I think.
There was a question back there, then we can take that one over there. Yeah.
Just wanted to shift gears to insurance. I haven't used the BRAC program in a long time. The last time I tried to use it, the deductible and the premium cost from the provider, it was easier to, we were better off to self-insure sort of the risk, if you will, and the guidelines or the underwriting, whatever they call it, the policy, the smaller sites or the smaller projects didn't really lend themselves or qualify. You were really insuring, an area that you would put a telephone pole in to a site. Has any of that, I haven't been following that, has any of that changed or loosened up in terms of the coverage?
Yeah, I mean, I know from a contribution standpoint, early on they started out at 50%. They dropped to 25 a couple of years ago, but last couple of years they're back up to 50%, but they've qualified that. So the criteria in order to get into, so does everybody know what BRAC is? BRAC is an insurance subsidy in the state of Massachusetts, and there's two things as a criteria within that program. One is there has to be a lender, and two, there has to be an environmental condition out there. And then you have to apply to the BRAC program. And that's a relatively easy process. It's a one-page application. We certainly can help you with that. But what it pays is it pays 50%, up to $50,000 for. So these programs, unlike traditional lines of coverage where you buy one-year policies, these programs can be written up to 10 years with a number of carriers. The carrier has to be approved by BRAC. Most of them are. But what they pay is they pay 50% of the pre-existing conditions premium. So you can buy pre-existing conditions coverage, which provides coverage anything from the inception date going back in perpetuity for anything that happened historically. And then there's new conditions, that anything that commenced after the effective date. Okay? So theoretically, you could find something 2 years from now that happened way back in 1967. That would be considered a pre-existing condition. So when carriers go through that rating mechanism, and bring down the cone of silence here, okay? When you're negotiating with carriers, there's a lot of flexibility on how much of that money can go to pre-existing conditions, especially if you've got a site that has historic uses and significant environmental conditions out there. So a lot of that premium could be weighed towards the pre-existing conditions. So you could maximize out. I mean, the last two BRAC deals I did, we maxed out at $50,000 contributions from the state. So it's a great program. I mean, it's one of the few states that do it. There was a time, you probably remember back when there was a time where they had limitations on what they were willing to offer. There are no limitations anymore. In fact, when they first started the program, it was only AIG that, if you went to AIG, that was the only company that would be eligible for a BRAC refund. Now they're all eligible. So it's a much more competitive situation.
Question for Joe or George. Any experience with former owner CGL policies, pre-pollution exclusion days, and any success cost recovering off of those?
Yeah, so
I'm just going to bring that up.
yeah, so prior to 1986, policies did not have environmental or pollution exclusions under them, or they had some form of coverage. And then when you go back to like the mid-70s, there was no pollution exclusions in there. So basically what squashed that was all the asbestos claims. There are companies that are still paying claims today, because back then defense was outside the limits. So carriers, you know, as long as there was a defense cost, carriers keep on paying. The only thing that erodes the limits of the policy is if they're paying some kind of award on the suit. So so there's services out there, insurance archaeology, where they can actually go out. So these are, and most of these were all, not most of them, they were all occurrence forms back then. And so if the claim took place in that year, you had coverage in that year. So you could file a claim at any time. Even 10 years from now, if there's coverage available, you can go back to those policies. So it's a great avenue to explore, especially if you have historical, long-term historical contamination. You want to add to that, George?
Yeah, he's busting my chops here. So, I mean, you nailed it. I was actually just about to bring that up, and then Paul brought it up. And so it's obviously something you need to check. If you had a company, if your client is a company that was in operation prior to '86 and the further back into the early '80s and into the '70s, as Joe said, the better. And if they kept their files in reasonable shape, that they can find these policies, that could potentially be a gold mine. And since you guys are going to get paid by those insurance policies, it could be a gold mine for you too. So you definitely should suggest it to your client if you find yourself advising a client who has an operation that he's closing or moving, and they've been there a while, pre-86. A great way to do it. And if they have the files, it's relatively easy. If they don't have the files, there's actually, as Joe mentioned, there's attorneys now that are they're actually called insurance archaeologists, and they will try to go back. I don't know where they go, but they find this stuff, and it's literally like finding gold. Paul just mentioned unions, and I said, well, why don't you talk about it? And he said, no, you talk about it. You're from New Jersey. So I guess I'll take the hit. And by the way, where I build in Jersey City in the waterfront and high rise and you know, steel and concrete, you're almost always building a union anyway, because when you have a very large job, you probably can't get skilled labor at the scale you need to put up a big high rise project. So we generally build union, or at least open shop, where union is bidding the work. And they usually win the bid just because of manpower requirements. The gentleman in the back that mentioned, you know, having all these government programs, I always thought it was a shame that when there's government programs and subsidies, they require a prevailing wage, because prevailing wage normally means union. But, you know, you look at politics and how it works, you know, if the Democrats are in control, then usually the unions vote Democrat, and so they pay them back by putting prevailing wage requirements into the rules, and it makes perfect sense. It's just logical that that's the way the system works. So, you know, if you are in a situation where you're in a union environment, your costs are probably going to be a little higher, but you may be in a large-scale project that can't be built by anything other than the capacity that a union-sized contractor can bring to the table. And so it's really a little bit of both. It's a little bit of that. They kind of have an inside track, particularly if there's government financing involved, plus they have the manpower to get larger projects done. So, you know, I'm not pro-union, I'm not against union. I a little bit think the prevailing wage rules are skewed, which they are, on government subsidy programs, because it certainly doesn't make the government assistance as effective and as efficient as it otherwise could be. And that's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to be leaving Massachusetts as soon as this conference is over.
We had a question, yes?
Yeah, the underground storage tank program that Bill is very familiar with has a submittal process and an approval process that's really onerous. What's the process with the tax credits? Because you've talked a lot about things getting rejected and stuff. How does it actually work once you submit?
It's a very simple one-page form that you fill out that gives certain. It talks about the taxpayer, the tax ID number, the address, the total amount of remediation costs, and then there's a 15% test. And I could just lay out for you what there's 7 criteria that to get this tax credit. The 15% test is that you have to spend at least 15% of the assessed, well, your remediation cost must be 15% or more of what the assessed value of the property is at the time of remediation. So you will have a dollar amount there on that form, and then there's a block that says why you think you meet this statute, and then you should just lay out these 7 criteria. So it's actually a simple form to submit, but that's but once you submit it, that's when you get into this shark tank, if you will, because
They ask you questions?
yeah. Yes, and I'll tell you because you need to. It's only for business or commercial use, so you meet that criteria. It has to be in an economically distressed area. That is just listing of cities and towns in Massachusetts, and you're either on that list or you're not. There are some towns where they will not be, the town itself is not on the list, but certain census tracts within that town, like Lexington and Peabody are like that. So, those are easy criteria. This 15% test, you get an assessed value of the property per the town's records, and that's so if your remediation began in 2003, you'll be looking at the assessed value in 2003, and if that assessed value was $1 million, then your remediation cost must equal $150,000 or more, otherwise you're not going to get the tax credit. You have to have, as we've talked before, you have to have your permanent solution or ROS in place prior to applying for the tax credit. You have to be in compliance with DEP. So if there's an enforcement action or an unpaid fine or any kind of unresolved issue with DEP, they're not going to give you your tax credit. And then only certain entities can get these tax credits, and basically the restriction is no state entity, no town, no municipality. So, so there is a way to perhaps get around that. If you've got a municipality, you'd have to have it transferred out to a developer or do a lease agreement. And the final criteria is that you have to submit to them what your eligible costs are. These costs we've talked about that are...
With invoices?
Well, that's the thing. They first require you to just submit a spreadsheet. So you'll build a spreadsheet, and then the application itself gets filed to the Bureau of Desk Audit in Department of Revenue. So it will get assigned to a particular auditor, and then they will audit test that spreadsheet that you're sending them. So, and probably what they'll do is take each category, so if it's excavation or if it's LSP costs or testing, and they'll come back to you and want a certain number of invoices in each category. Sometimes they'll go deeper than that and want to see actual canceled checks. So we generally will gather all of those at the outset of an engagement, not submit them, but have them on hand so that we don't get an issue. In terms of these invoices and checks, it's the taxpayer itself that spent the money and is either the owner or lessee that's entitled to the credit. So if you have a development where you've got one entity that now owns the property, and it's usually a single-use entity that's maybe newly created. You may have had another affiliated entity that had paid for the testing or the other costs. So then we've got to make sure that there's a reimbursement between the two, approve the relationship, and so it does get into a lot of details which could be fact-specific. So while filing the form is pretty basic, you are going to then get into this discourse with that auditor back and forth, and they're going to be requesting documents. And you can sort of start to tell by the documents they're requesting from you how they're going with their thinking. And so it's important that you disclose to them what they want, but you're not giving them too much, because they are going to try and look for ways to not give you what you're applying for. So
I wanted just to touch upon that the list of economically distressed areas is actually in the back right there if anyone wants to look at it to see if any sites are on there. It's about 2/3 of Massachusetts. And then with that form that we send, internally we also send an analysis of eligibility with that tax credit form.
So just explain what that does.
So the analysis of eligibility is basically a giant packet that we do that answers the questions on that form in greater detail. We use our in-house counsel for that because it's actually a description of everything that's happened on the site, why it's happened, and a description of each line item on the invoices. So though it seems like a form and the invoice and canceled checks, there's actually
not.
a lot more that goes into it based on the line items and how the process went. We need to explain about the entity, we need to talk about why they're doing it, and we need to talk about the end result.
And there's a couple other things that they've also implemented over the last 2 years. One is that they look to now see, which they didn't before, that the taxpayer applying for the credit is up to date in all their taxes. I mean, it makes sense, but they really didn't used to do that before. But they also look to make sure that your tax returns are up to date. And so the one time that kind of slows us down is when you have your newly formed entity that hasn't yet filed a tax return. So we have to show that that's all up to date. And now there's a new thing they've just instituted, which is that you now have to show that the taxpayer has to show that they're up to date with their unemployment insurance contributions and taxes to the state. So those things are not on the form, but I think as you apply, you should have that proof that everything's up to date, and there's a certain certificate that you get for proof that you're up to date and unemployment insurance, and have all of those things on hand. So
I think we have time for one more question, and we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
Well, could you talk a little bit about the transferring from tax-exempt organizations and how that's handled?
you mean you've got
If
a
the client is a nonprofit that doesn't pay state tax.
Okay, so if you're transferring your tax credit, then and you're doing that for consideration, the money that is received is taxable. If you are a nonprofit, then you don't pay taxes. You don't pay taxes, but there is the unincorporated business tax. So you have to be careful about those things. But I think what you're asking for is how we could put a structure in place that assists a tax-paying entity from paying taxes by utilizing a nonprofit.
For a school developing on property, you have incurring costs on a brownfields development. You're transferring those to, aren't you on the market and selling those credits?
Yes.
Yeah. So nonprofits are allowed, since 2006, are allowed to receive the Brownfields tax credit and are allowed to transfer it. That the money that's coming in is going to be taxable. However, with a nonprofit, you're not paying taxes. But I think your one risk is that you may be obligated for unincorporated business tax. But I think Craig would be able to. I don't want to put you on the spot, but you guys are a nonprofit. I think the question was, if you transfer the tax credit and bring in equity, which is generally taxable to a for-profit company, how are you treated as a nonprofit? No tax liability.
Yeah, I sit on a couple of nonprofit boards, and I think there's different kinds of income. There's income in the course of the operation of the nonprofit, which is not taxable, but there's other income that can be taxable. So your bottom line is sign up for a tax seminar and ask that question to a bunch of CPAs. What's that? Yeah, my guess is, but I'm not a CPA. My guess is that the sale of the income as a result of the sale of tax credits would probably be taxable. It's my guess, but I don't know for sure.
Well, a nonprofit, since 2006, a nonprofit can receive the tax credit, and the tax credit became transferable. So whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit, if you're the taxpayer earning that tax credit, you can legally transfer that tax credit. So a nonprofit can sell that tax credit just as a for-profit would. There's no difference. I think where we were getting entangled is that once the income comes into the entity, as a for-profit, it's taxable. As a nonprofit, it's not taxable. So generally, it's not taxable, but there is the unincorporated business tax where if you're getting revenue that's not in your mission or purpose, then it can be considered to be income that's taxable. Unrelated. What did I say? Okay.
And what percent do you usually get for that? If Frank's finding some of the credits, how much of the dollar do they get back?
Oh.
They're not going to get 100% when they sell it, right?
No. So we sold tax credits this week for 94 cents on the dollar. That's the highest that I've seen, that I've gotten. But we can get. We've got buyers any day of the week that'll pay 91, 92, 93. 94 is high, but if you give me any amount of tax credits, I will sell them for you at no less than 92, 93.
And we want your tax credits. I think we can wrap this up. Does anyone have any last comments or questions?
Thank you, very informative.
Thank you all for attending. There's refreshments. There's some refreshments in the back. Please help yourself. And anyone attending for credit, Lily's out front with your certificates. Thank you.